The United States hit Venezuela with a large-scale strike early Saturday and said its president, Nicolás Maduro, had been captured and flown out of the country. Here's what to know. Multiple explosions and low-flying aircraft were seen in Caracas in the early hours of Saturday morning. Maduro's government immediately accused the US of an imperialist attack on civilian and military installations. US President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that Maduro had been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. He added that the operation was done in conjunction with US law enforcement.
So, this just happened. In what might be one of the most stunning military operations in recent history, the United States just launched a massive strike on Venezuela and captured President Nicolás Maduro. Yeah, you heard that right. The president of a sovereign nation was literally dragged out of his bedroom in the middle of the night by American Special Forces. Let me walk you through what we know so far, because this story is absolutely wild. Early Saturday morning around 2 a.m. local time in Caracas, explosions rocked the Venezuelan capital. Witnesses reported at least 7 major blasts, low-flying aircraft and plumes of smoke rising over the city. People rushed into the streets trying to figure out what was happening. Social media lit up with videos showing tracer fire streaking across the night sky and the distinctive sound of heavy machine guns echoing through residential neighborhoods. Some areas lost power completely, plunging entire districts into darkness. What they didn't know yet was that the United States military had just launched what President Trump called one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and confidence in American history. And honestly, the scale of this operation is genuinely unprecedented. According to reports, this wasn't some quick in-and-out operation. More than 150 aircraft launched from bases across the Western Hemisphere. We're talking helicopters, fighter jets, surveillance drones, refueling tankers, the works. The coordination alone is mind-boggling. The main target was Fuerte Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex, where Maduro and his wife were sleeping in their home within the compound. The U.S. turned off most of the lights in Caracas as forces moved in. Think about that for a second. They literally cut power to major sections of the capital city. Elite Delta Force operators, backed by FBI units specializing in high-value target extraction, flew in at low altitude to avoid detection. They came under fire when they arrived, but spent several hours on the ground fighting their way to Maduro's compound. Venezuelan military units stationed at Fuerte Tiuna engaged the American forces. There are reports of intense firefights, but the U.S. forces had overwhelming air support. Apache helicopters provided cover while the ground teams advanced. Around 1 a.m., they breached the building. 2 sources say Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were dragged from their bedroom while they were sleeping. The couple was restrained, blindfolded, and extracted from the compound. By 3:29 a.m. Eastern Time, they were airborne and out of Venezuelan airspace. A few U.S. soldiers were injured during the operation. One helicopter took heavy fire but made it back safely. Miraculously, there were no American deaths, though the Venezuelan government claims both military personnel and civilians were killed in the strikes. The exact casualty numbers remain unclear, and honestly, we might not know the full picture for a while. Now here's where it gets even crazier. Trump posted a photo on Truth Social showing Maduro aboard the USS Iwo Jima. The image shows him in a gray tracksuit, handcuffed and blindfolded, being transported to face charges in New York. The photo immediately went viral, with reactions ranging from celebration to horror depending on who you ask. And what are those charges? Maduro's been indicted on narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons charges. The U.S. has been after him since 2020, offering increasingly larger bounties for his capture. It started at $15 million, went up to $25 million under Biden, and Trump bumped it to $50 million last August. But wait, there's more. Attorney General Pam Bondi unsealed a new indictment saying Maduro ran state-sponsored gangs and facilitated massive drug trafficking operations. Trump's administration has been calling him the head of Cartel de los Soles, which they designated as a foreign terrorist organization back in August. According to the indictment, Venezuela under Maduro became a narco-state, with government officials at the highest levels coordinating with Colombian cartels to move cocaine through the country and into the United States. The allegations paint a picture of systematic corruption where military officers, intelligence officials, and even cabinet members were on cartel payrolls. Maduro arrived in New York on Saturday evening, landing at Stewart Air National Guard Base. Video footage shows him being walked through DEA headquarters in Manhattan, surrounded by dozens of federal agents. His arraignment is expected Monday. Legal experts say he'll likely plead not guilty and fight extradition even though he's already on U.S. soil. So what happens next? Well, that's where things get complicated. Trump held a press conference at Mar-a-Lago and dropped this bombshell. We're going to run the country. Not help run it, not advise. Actually run Venezuela. He said the U.S. would be in charge until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. When pressed on how long that would be, Trump couldn't say. He suggested it could involve a long-term U.S. military presence, potentially months or even years. Here's the thing, though. Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, according to the Venezuelan Constitution, should take over as acting president. Trump said she'd been sworn in and had spoken with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and that she was essentially willing to do what we think is necessary to make Venezuela great again. But then Rodriguez appeared on Venezuelan state television, flanked by her brother Jorge, who heads the National Assembly, Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello, and Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez. And she said something completely different. She declared that Maduro is the only president of Venezuela and demanded his release. So who's actually running Venezuela right now? Honestly, nobody really knows. The country's constitution says Rodriguez should take over, and their top court even ordered her to assume the role. But she's refusing, calling Maduro's capture illegal under international law. The real power in Venezuela has been held by a small circle of senior officials for years. Analysts point to Diosdado Cabello as someone to watch closely. He controls the military and civilian counterintelligence agencies, SEBIN and DGCIM, and has been described as the most ideological, violent, and unpredictable element of the Venezuelan regime. These intelligence agencies have a horrific track record. The United Nations found that both SEBIN and DGCIM have committed crimes against humanity as part of a state plan to crush dissent. Former detainees described electric shocks, simulated drownings, sexual abuse, and prolonged solitary confinement in filthy cells. We're talking about systematic torture as official policy. Cabello himself has been linked to drug trafficking operations. The U.S. Treasury designated him as a narcotics kingpin back in 2018. Some analysts worry that with Maduro gone, Cabello might try to seize full control himself, which could make the situation even worse. Trump publicly closed the door on working with Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who recently won the Nobel Peace Prize for her fight for democracy. He said she doesn't have the support or the respect within the country, which is interesting considering she had a 72% approval rating in polls last March. She's been living in hiding, facing constant threats from the Maduro regime. He also didn't offer support to Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition candidate who international observers say actually won Venezuela's 2024 presidential election. Machado has issued a statement saying Gonzalez should take office as the legitimate president, but Trump seems more interested in installing his own transitional government than supporting the opposition that Venezuelans actually voted for. The political reactions have been predictably divided along party lines, but there are some interesting exceptions. Most Republicans are cheering this on. Senator Tom Cotton called it an incredible operation and said Maduro wasn't just an illegitimate dictator, but also ran a vast drug trafficking operation that threatened American communities. Senator Rick Scott thanked Trump and said, "A new day is here for Venezuela and Latin America." Vice President J.D. Vance said the operation shows that Trump means what he says and that the president offered multiple off-ramps, but was clear that the drug trafficking had to stop. He framed it as Trump giving Maduro plenty of warnings before taking action. Down in Florida, which has the largest Venezuelan population in the U.S., Representative Byron Donald celebrated, saying Maduro was one of the largest narco-traffickers in the world and a threat to our national security. Florida Republicans see this as a massive political win, especially with their large Venezuelan American constituency. Senator Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State, has been one of the most hawkish voices on Venezuela for years. He's calling this the beginning of a new chapter for the Venezuelan people and promising that the U.S. will help rebuild the country. But not all Republicans are on board. Former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who's now the Director of National Intelligence, has a complicated history here. Back in 2019, when she was running for president as a Democrat, she vehemently opposed military intervention in Venezuela. She wrote that it was about the oil again, and said, throughout history, every time the U.S. topples a foreign country's dictator, the outcome has been disastrous. Now she's in the awkward position of being part of the administration that just did exactly what she warned against. She's been notably quiet since the operation, which has led to speculation about whether she approved of this action or whether she was sidelined in the decision-making process. Democrats are largely condemning the operation. The biggest concern? Trump didn't seek congressional authorization before launching the attack. He admitted he only notified Congress after the strikes began because Congress has a tendency to leak. That's not how this is supposed to work under the Constitution. Democratic Senator Mark Warner, Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, raised a critical question. Does this mean any large country can indict the ruler of a smaller adjacent country and take that person out? Think about that for a second. If the U.S. can do this to Venezuela, what's to stop Russia from doing it to Ukraine, or China from doing it to Taiwan? Even if we argue those situations are different because Maduro was indicted in U.S. courts, other countries aren't going to care about that distinction. They're going to see this as big countries being allowed to invade small countries whenever they want. Representative Maxwell Frost from Florida was even more blunt. What President Trump is doing in Venezuela is illegal, dangerous, and outside of the bounds of his constitutional authority. No president can unilaterally drag our nation into a war without congressional authorization. Representative Greg Casar from Texas said Trump had no right to take us to war with Venezuela. This is reckless and illegal. Nikki Fried, chair of the Florida Democratic Party, said, while she hopes this opens a path to democracy for Venezuela, Congress and the American people were entirely bypassed. Acting without congressional authorization risks deepening chaos and instability. House Democrats are already talking about holding hearings. Some are even floating the possibility of impeachment proceedings, though with Republicans controlling both chambers of Congress, that's unlikely to go anywhere. The international reaction has been, let's say, mixed, leaning heavily toward condemnation. Brazil's President Lula da Silva was particularly harsh, saying the U.S. had crossed an unacceptable line, and that attacking countries in flagrant violation of international law is the first step toward a world of violence, chaos, and instability. Brazil shares a massive border with Venezuela and is deeply concerned about refugee flows and regional instability. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum condemned the military intervention outright and posted the UN Charter article stating members shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Mexico has historically been sensitive to U.S. military interventions in Latin America, and this hits close to home. Russia's foreign ministry called it an act of armed aggression and said Venezuela must be guaranteed the right to determine its own destiny without military intervention. They're calling for an emergency UN Security Council meeting. Russia has been a major arms supplier to Venezuela and has economic interests in Venezuelan oil fields, so they're not happy about this. China also condemned the strikes, which makes sense since both Russia and China have been aligned with Venezuela for years. China has loaned billions to Venezuela and has significant investments in the country. They're worried about the precedent this sets for international relations. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer took a more cautious approach, saying the UK wasn't involved and that he wanted to establish the facts and speak with Trump before commenting further. But he emphasized that Britain should all uphold international law. The UK is in an awkward position, trying to maintain its special relationship with the US, while not endorsing what looks like a clear violation of international norms. Even some of Trump's supporters struggled with this. Nigel Farage, leader of the UK's Reform Party and longtime Trump ally, called the attack unorthodox and contrary to international law, but suggested it may be a good thing if it makes China and Russia think twice. That's some pretty twisted logic. Trinidad and Tobago explicitly stated they are not a participant in any of these ongoing military operations and continue to maintain peaceful relations with Venezuela. As Venezuela's neighbor, they're worried about being dragged into a conflict, Meanwhile, in Venezuela itself, the reactions are complicated. In Doral, Florida, nicknamed Doralzuela because of its massive Venezuelan population, people poured into the streets in the middle of the night, some still in pajamas, waving Venezuelan flags and celebrating. One woman said, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you, President of the United States. I've been waiting for years." These celebrations happened in Venezuelan communities across the U.S., in Miami, Houston, New York. For people who fled Maduro's regime, this feels like justice finally being served. But in Caracas, the mood is very different. One resident said, "How do I feel? Scared, like everyone." Venezuelans woke up scared. Many families couldn't sleep. Another Caracas resident told reporters they're not in support of the invasion or violence, but they're also not in support of Maduro staying in power after losing the election. "We are humble citizens. We're caught. There is so much uncertainty and so much fear." That captures the complexity of the situation on the ground. Many Venezuelans hated Maduro, but they're also terrified of their country being occupied by a foreign military. Let's talk about the legal questions because there are a lot of them. First, did Trump have the legal authority to do this? The answer is extremely murky. Back in November, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles told Vanity Fair that land strikes in Venezuela would require congressional approval. She specifically said, if Trump were to authorize some activity on land, then it's war, then Congress would need to approve. Well, here we are, and Congress wasn't consulted beforehand. Trump's justification is that Maduro was indicted in U.S. courts on narco-terrorism charges. But does having an indictment give you the right to invade another country and capture its leader? International law experts are deeply skeptical. The UN Charter is pretty clear that member states shall refrain from using force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. There are exceptions for self-defense or when authorized by the UN Security Council. The U.S. is claiming this falls under some kind of counter-narcotics law enforcement action, but that's a huge stretch. Think about it this way. If this logic holds, any country could issue an arrest warrant for another country's leader and then invade to enforce it. That's not how international law works. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. Venezuela has requested an emergency UN Security Council meeting. Colombia also pushed for one, which is scheduled for Monday morning. Expect fireworks there because Russia and China will definitely veto any resolution supporting the U.S. action. Some commentators argue that even though heads of state enjoy immunity from prosecution under international law, few world leaders recognize Maduro as a legitimate head of state anyway. He stayed in power after losing the 2024 election according to international observers. But that's still a very controversial legal position. Who gets to decide which leaders are legitimate and which aren't? There's also the precedent this sets. Trump himself referenced the Monroe Doctrine during his press conference, calling it the Donroe Doctrine as a nod to his increasingly aggressive foreign policy. The Monroe Doctrine was the historic U.S. position that European powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere. But here's the thing. The U.S. has now demonstrated it's willing to conduct regime change operations in its own hemisphere. Trump said at his press conference that Colombia and Cuba should know the consequences of not cooperating with the United States. That's not a suggestion. That's a threat. Marco Rubio specifically mentioned isolating Cuba as a next step. Representative Mario Diaz-Balart went further, saying, "The first of those tyrannies has not survived President Trump. The next two, their days are also counted," referring to Cuba and Nicaragua. This operation was timed very deliberately, by the way. It took place exactly 36 years to the day after the U.S. invasion of Panama that led to the capture of Manuel Noriega in 1990. That's not a coincidence. Trump loves symbolic gestures like this. The Panama operation was controversial at the time, but is now generally seen as having achieved its objectives. However, Panama is tiny compared to Venezuela. Venezuela has 10 times the population and a much more complex political situation. There's also the question of what Trump actually wants from Venezuela. During his press conference, he talked extensively about Venezuela's oil reserves. He said the U.S. operation won't cost us anything because American oil companies would invest in new infrastructure. It's going to make a lot of money, he said. Remember what Tulsi Gabbard said back in 2019? It's about the oil, again. And she quoted John Bolton admitting, "It would make a difference if we could have American companies produce the oil in Venezuela." Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia. The problem is that decades of mismanagement, corruption, and sanctions have destroyed the industry's infrastructure. Production has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day to less than 700,000. Trump sees an opportunity here. American oil companies could potentially rebuild Venezuela's oil industry and profit enormously. But here's the question. Is that what Venezuelans want? Or is this just another case of a powerful country exploiting a weaker one's natural resources? Trump also made a bizarre claim that Venezuela owes the U.S. land and oil rights. He said, "We want it back." What? Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1975 after decades of foreign companies having almost exclusive access. Before that, going back to the early 20th century, a Venezuelan dictator named Juan Vicente Gómez did allow foreign companies that kind of access. Is Trump saying he wants to roll back 50 years of Venezuelan sovereignty over its own natural resources? That's essentially what he's suggesting, and it's not going over well internationally. Let's talk about some of Trump's other claims, because fact-checkers have been busy. Trump said Maduro sent members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua to the United States. There's actually no evidence for this. The Justice Department indictment doesn't mention it. An April 2025 report from the U.S. National Intelligence Council actually contradicted Trump, saying, while Venezuela's permissive environment enables TDA to operate, the Maduro regime probably does not have a policy of cooperating with TDA and is not directing TDA movement to and operations in the United States. So while it's true that Tren de Aragua has become a problem in some U.S. cities, blaming Maduro for deliberately sending them here doesn't match the intelligence. It's also worth noting that Trump recently pardoned former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted of trafficking hundreds of tons of cocaine into the U.S. So the administration's stance on drug trafficking seems selective. They're willing to invade Venezuela over drug allegations but pardon a convicted drug trafficker from Honduras. So what's actually going to happen now? In the short term, Maduro and his wife are being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, awaiting arraignment on Monday. This is the same facility that's held high-profile defendants like R. Kelly and Ghislaine Maxwell. Security there is extremely tight. In Venezuela, the situation is extremely unstable. Trump says a team comprised of his cabinet officials will be running the country alongside a local team in Venezuela. He specifically mentioned Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and others would serve as de facto leaders. Think about how insane that is. The U.S. Secretary of State is going to be running Venezuela? How does that even work logistically? Is Rubio going to move to Caracas? Is he going to govern via Zoom calls? But the Venezuelan government is still functioning. Rodriguez and her allies are still in power and refusing to step down. The military largely remains loyal to the old regime. Diosdado Cabello still controls the intelligence apparatus with all its resources and armed personnel. What happens if there's armed resistance? Trump was asked if he'd commit ground troops, and he didn't rule it out. He said the U.S. was prepared with a second wave of troops that was not ultimately needed during the operation, suggesting there are more forces ready to deploy if necessary. Some experts think this could turn into a prolonged occupation. The United States has a highly mixed record at best at leading regime change operations across the globe. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. None of these worked out the way we hoped. Why would Venezuela be different? Venezuela has been in economic collapse for over a decade under Maduro. Inflation reached levels rarely seen outside of wartime. An estimated 80% of residents live in poverty. The healthcare system has collapsed. Basic goods are unavailable. 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country. The people desperately want change. But do they want American military rule? There's a real question about whether this makes the drug trafficking problem better or worse. Trump says this was all about stopping narco-terrorism. But Venezuela is now in chaos. The government is divided. The military might splinter. Is a destabilized, occupied Venezuela more or less likely to be a transit point for drugs? History suggests things might actually get worse before they get better. When you create a power vacuum, criminal organizations rush in to fill it. And what about the Venezuelan people who fled to the United States? Adelis Ferro, executive director of the Venezuelan American Caucus, said, "I hope Trump understands Venezuelans here in the U.S. also fled and need protection. It's no time for more attacks and persecution of Venezuelan immigrants." Trump's been hostile to Venezuelan migrants. He's refused to extend temporary protected status, which would allow Venezuelans already in the U.S. to stay and work legally. As Representative Frost pointed out, President Trump thinks that Maduro is a big enough problem to take illegal actions in Venezuela, but not a big enough problem to provide Venezuelans with temporary protected status. That's a pretty glaring contradiction. If the situation in Venezuela is so dire that it justifies military invasion, why aren't we protecting Venezuelan refugees? Look, there's no question Maduro was a brutal dictator. He rigged elections, crushed dissent, presided over economic catastrophe, and forced millions to flee. The UN found his security forces committed crimes against humanity. Opponents were tortured, disappeared, killed. He deserved to face justice. But the way this happened raises massive questions. The lack of congressional approval, the violation of international law, the precedent it sets for other countries, the unclear endgame, the potential for this to spiral into a prolonged conflict. Trump said this shows the U.S. is reasserting American power. But at what cost? There's also a question of whether this was even necessary. Maduro's regime was already weakening. The opposition was gaining strength. International pressure was mounting. Some analysts think he might have fallen on his own within a year or two. Did we really need to invade? This is being called Operation Absolute Resolve, and it's only the beginning. The UN Security Council meeting is Monday. Maduro's arraignment is Monday. Venezuela's military might resist. Cuba and Nicaragua are watching nervously, wondering if they're next. And somewhere in Brooklyn, in a detention center, sits the former president of a sovereign nation, arrested by a foreign power in a midnight raid. However you feel about Maduro, about Trump, about U.S. foreign policy, this is a massive moment. The implications are going to ripple through international relations for years to come. We might look back on this as the moment when the post-Cold War international order finally broke down completely. We'll keep watching this story as it develops. This is just the beginning.